This video is about cells. Cells are the smallest level of organization where life can exist. Sometimes cells are referred to as the basic units of structure and function because it's the structure of cells that often give larger things like tissues and organs their functions. So cells can be very specific in their structures, like nerve cells, for example, could be very long and narrow. Bone cells are different than nerve cells. What we're going to look at in this video is just some generic cells to get an idea of some of their parts and what they do. The three main things we're going to focus on are cell organelles, those are cell parts, movement across membranes, osmosis and diffusion, and then how cells get energy. So first, cell organelles and what they do. Here's a picture of a generic cell. Notice that it's made of a lot of parts. Starting at the top with centrioles, those are significant for cell division in animal cells, not so much in plant cells. The mitochondrion or mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. That's where the energy is going to be produced. Microtubules are part of the cytoskeleton, the skeleton of the cell. It gives it structure. Cytoplasm is a fluid that fills the cell. The cell membrane helps to protect the cell and separate it from its environment. Golgi apparatus packages things that are made in the cell. The endoplasmic reticulum helps to transport things. Often it's on the rough endoplasmic reticulum where the ribosomes are located that proteins are manufactured. The nucleus holds the DNA of the cell, and inside the nucleus is the nucleolus. Microvilli, these projections, sometimes we call them cilia or flagella, but projections from the membrane of the cell can help move things around the cell or maybe even help the cell move. So let's look at some movement across membranes. So these are things like osmosis and diffusion, active and passive transport. The cell membrane is a lipid bilayer. That means it's made up. The cell membrane is a lipid bilayer. That means it's made up of two layers of lipids. The blue represents a phosphate head, and the two red lines attached to each blue circle in that picture represent the lipid chains. So we've got a phospholipid, the phosphate attached to these lipid chains. That bilayer separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. That's because oils and water don't mix. The lipids separate themselves from the water environment of the cell. You'll notice that there's not just phospholipids in the cell membrane. There's also proteins and carbohydrates in the cell membrane. That's what makes it a fluid mosaic. So fluid in the sense that those proteins and carbohydrates embedded in the membrane often move around. Mosaic because it's made of more than one thing. The cell membrane is selectively permeable. That means some things can enter the cell. Small things like oxygen can diffuse across the membrane. Other things, larger molecules, need to use those protein channels to move through the cell membrane. So some things enter the cell, some things leave the cell, but not everything. So it's selectively permeable. To understand a little bit about diffusion across membranes, we need to understand a little bit more about solutions. Solutions are made of two parts: the solute, whatever you're mixing, and the solvent, the thing that's doing the dissolving. In our body, typically water is the solvent. In this case, we're going to mix sugar with the water to make a sugar-water solution. I can increase the concentration of that solution by adding more solute or sugar. I can dilute the solution by adding more water, the solvent. Diffusion just means moving of molecules from an area where they're highly concentrated to an area where they're in low concentration. If you look at the diagram, the molecules are in high concentration outside of the cell membrane, and they're diffusing across just by random movement, no energy required. They're going from an area where there are a lot to an area where there are fewer. They're just spreading out by random movement. That's diffusion. So think of diffusion as passive. It doesn't require any energy. It's kind of like going down a slide. You're going from a high place to a low place, an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Here we have two different solutions on opposite sides of a semi-permeable membrane, and these molecules will be moving randomly, and they're going from an area where there's more to an area where there's less. The orange molecules are moving from the A side to the B side because there's more on the A side, less on the B side. And the blue molecules are moving from B to A because there were more on the B side and less on the A side. We can do a little experiment showing this idea of movement and how some things can pass through semi-permeable membranes with a dialysis tubing sac. That's what's in the beaker. We'll add some sugar and starch to the inside of that membrane. On the outside, we'll put a starch indicator, like iodine. After we give it a little bit of time, we'll notice that the indicator, the iodine, can move through the membrane and turn that starch purple. We also notice that the starch cannot get out of that membrane. Otherwise, the solution in the beaker would be purple. So some things can enter those membranes, some things cannot. Semi-permeable. Because there's a higher concentration of iodine outside the membrane, it's moving in to the membrane. If your blood cells are placed into a solution where there's a higher concentration of water molecules outside the cell, those water molecules will move into the cell, causing it to swell. That type of solution is called hypotonic. The cell is swelling up like an O. If the cell is placed into a solution where there is a low concentration of water molecules, then the water molecules from the cell will leave the cell to dilute the solution that it's in. That's called a hypertonic solution. What will be a hypertonic solution? If you put a red blood cell in seawater, seawater is so salty that there's a very low concentration of water, very high concentration of salt outside the cell. Inside the cell, there's a higher concentration of water, so the water is diffusing out of the cell and causing that cell to shrivel up. If you were to put a cell in distilled water, then there's a very high concentration of water molecules outside the cell, and those water molecules are diffusing through the membrane into the cell, causing it to swell up. An isotonic solution means that the concentration of water is the same inside the cell as outside, so there's an even amount of movement across that membrane. Isotonic solutions are things like saline solution, where you might use that as an IV or for your contacts. How does water get through the membrane if it's made of lipids and oils and waters don't mix? That's a good question. Water diffuses across the plasma membrane through protein gates called aquaporin. So think of it like water pours in, aqua pour in. So these channels just remain open so that water molecules can move through those channels. This process is called facilitated diffusion. It's not passive. It's still passive, but it's diffusion that needs a little bit of help. So no energy is required, but there needs to be a presence, like a doorway, through the cell membrane for the water to get in. Active transport is different than passive because it requires energy. Think of it like going up a slide. You're going from an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. That requires some energy. Normally that energy is stored in a molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy currency of the cell. In this case, we're moving the molecules from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. So from B to A. But it does require energy. Other examples of active transport are things like endocytosis or exocytosis. Endocytosis means something is entering the cell by the cell surrounding and engulfing it. Exocytosis would be the opposite, something inside the cell that the cell is releasing or exiting the cell. Let's look at metabolism and cellular energy. How does the cell get energy? It uses a molecule called ATP. The energy of ATP is stored in its chemical bonds. So think of it as an A with 3 P's connected to it. The energy is in that last chemical bond between the second and third phosphate, P. When that chemical bond is broken, energy is released. But that chemical bond can be restored, and your body has a process to do just that. One of the ways that it restores that chemical energy is through a molecule called creatine phosphate. You store ATP in your cells, so your cells can use it for energy. As you do exercise or as you move around, that's going to burn up some of this energy. Think of it like spending money. At some point you run out of money, just like at some point you run out of energy. When your energy is gone or your money is gone, well, then there's not much left for you to do. Creatine phosphate can add a phosphate to the ADP in order to recharge it. Think of it kind of like a rechargeable battery. Creatine phosphate is the first thing your body uses to recharge ATP. So what happens when you need some ATP? Well, another way that you can get that energy is through glycolysis. Glyco, sugar, lysis, split. Here, your body cells are splitting a glucose molecule. That gives you 2 ATP. Well, when you're using hundreds of thousands of ATP, 2 isn't very much. So your mitochondria, the energy producers of the cell, are going to help immensely. They help by creating ATP through a process called aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration means that this process needs oxygen. The first step is to take that half glucose molecule, it's called a pyruvate, that half glucose molecule, and convert it into something called acetyl-CoA. That acetyl-CoA can be used by the mitochondria in the presence of oxygen to make ATP. The byproducts are water and carbon dioxide. So as your body is making this energy molecule, it's giving off water and carbon dioxide. So the acetyl-CoA goes into the factory with some oxygen, and you get loads of ATP. That process is helped along by something called the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. That's how all these ATP are being produced. Let's say your cells don't have enough oxygen. Do they stop producing energy? And the answer is no. There's an emergency method they can use for energy, and that's called fermentation without oxygen, anaerobic. It starts the same way. A glucose molecule is split, but now instead of using that half glucose molecule in the mitochondria, that half glucose molecule is going to go through this process of fermentation. Much like alcoholic fermentation, if it were in plants, we get a low amount of ATP from this process, only 2. The downside of the process is that we also get this other byproduct called lactic acid. As lactic acid builds up in your muscles start to burn. You feel that burn in the muscles. So you go from having a lot of energy, 36 for each glucose you break down, to 2, and you start to build up lactic acid. Both of those things in combination, those lower amounts of ATP and the lactic acid, is what cause you to stop exercising. You're just too tired. And you need to breathe deeply, get lots of oxygen back to your muscles so that they can convert those molecules to ATP again, and you can start using the aerobic pathway to restore your energy levels. I hope that helps you understand a little bit about cells, movement across membranes, and how cells get energy.